My name is FX, or Felix, whatever you like more. This presentation was developed together with two guys that are not here today. So at some point I might actually not make sense because I'm talking about stuff that they know something about and I don't. But in general, what we're looking at is, like, if you look around you, every cool person sits there with an iPad, possibly connecting to the company network. So far, I haven't seen a single Chromebook here, but they might exist. And so the question was like, this is new client platforms. So they actually differ massively from what we used to have. Like, we used to have PCs, right? Personal computers that we had full control over. But nowadays, the trend is more towards devices that you buy from your religion, favorite vendor, and you use those devices and you trust them inherently. Which, at one side, it's a good thing because you stop worrying about installing software and shit. On the other hand, well, we're computer security persons. So we actually consider what the security of it is. And so we wanted to have a comparison between two massively different devices that differ in their background, in their motivation, the general idea, as well as the technical implementations. So what we looked at is the iPad first generation and the Google Chromebook. So just to be sure, what we're not covering in this presentation is iPhones, jailbreaks, the iPad 2, the iPad 3, although they're not really different. The whole question of jailbreaking, SIM unlocking, penises, and porn. So unfortunately, that's not here. Although the iPad is the actual penis extension that works and you can buy it online. No, seriously, because if you display a penis and you go like this, it gets bigger. So what's often overlooked, especially with hackers, is that people, namely companies, don't do what they do for religious reasons or because they're such good people, but because they make money. So when you look at a security architecture of a device, it always pays off to understand how this company makes money with the device. So in the case of the iPad, I'm sure most of you have read that last year, Apple actually made more money and sold more iPads than HP sold PCs worldwide. So there's more people buying this thing than people buying an actual proper PC that they have control over. Apple's business model is centered around selling individual devices. Like, everyone is supposed to have their own device. And then 30% of the App Store sale go to Apple, no matter what. And 30% of all the money you give your mobile phone provider goes to Apple as well. So they have a very, very high interest in selling as many devices as they can to make the, 28,000 shareholders of Apple more happy. It works quite well. As you can see in the numbers, the iPad 1 made them about $29 billion. So it's worth doing it, certainly. And from this business model comes the actual design goal of the security system. What they want is a consistent, fluent user interface, which you all have. They want integrity protection, but they want the integrity protection of their operating system and of the applications, and not of your data, for example. They want to restrict where software comes from, what software does, the capabilities, what's in the content. They want to control all that because they want their 30% share. Protecting the user data is actually not on the agenda. That is very important to understand because that doesn't make them any money. And if it doesn't make you any money, then you're not investing any money in it either. So where does the software come from? Everyone knows the App Store. You have an Apple ID. Apple goes ahead and like, if you try to sign up to the App Store, you get a heap of contracts. If you're into contract reading, I highly recommend, just for the sheer fun factor of it, to sign up as a developer in the App Store, because this contract is the most ridiculous you will ever see. So like, all rights go to Apple, but if anything goes wrong, Apple's damages are limited to $50. The sign-up fee is $99, so you already paid them for that. And like, when you submit software to the App Store, it goes through this review process that supposedly is about the security and the usability. In fact, it's completely damn random. I mean, you're submitting binary code, and go ask Chris from Veracode about how hard it is to automatically check binary code for any properties. That is essentially impossible, unless, of course, Apple's solved the Turing issue, the halting problem, but I'm not too sure about that. So essentially, it's really, really random, and you can't actually submit code that, for example, makes things in the iPhone better that are sold by Apple. So if you want to submit a new email client because the one on the iPhone sucks, it's not accepted because Apple doesn't want that. So on the other hand, look at Google. So why does Google now come out and make a Chromebook, which pretty much is in competition to the iPad? Google makes 96% of their income by selling ads and ad profiles. So essentially, the whole company centers around selling your profile to someone who wants to display ads to you. So they have a completely different motivation of coming out with a client platform. Also, what's fairly important with Google is, in contrast to Apple, where you have 28,000 different shareholders, at Google, 67% of the total share is controlled by 3 people. So they actually control the whole company, and they can do whatever they want, basically. But for their purpose, because they want to sell your online behavior, the information, the content that you produce, for this reason, it's of paramount importance to them that they actually secure the client platform. Because only if they secure the client platform, you as the user have enough trust, inherent trust in the client platform to put all your important data in there. And this is how they designed the Chromebook. So the Chromebook is actually a operating system that is only there to run a single application, which is the web browser. Because they don't want you to store any data locally. They want you to store the data in their cloud, obviously. It prevents any type of third-party software from running. And you know, it's designed to be fast and to be good, and also to appeal to the hearts of nerds. Google figured out very, very early that if you want to win over the general population, you have to win over the nerds first, because they're the technology lead. If the nerds say this is cool technology, many people are going to buy it. So, for example, take the Google DNS service. When Google came out with their DNS service, none of the nerds said, well, why would I use Google DNS service so Google knows every single NS lookup that I do? Everyone said, look at the IP addresses. It's 8.8.8.8. It's so cool. You know, that works. The same with the Chromebook. Like, all the software on there, with very few exceptions, it's open source. It's very well written software. It's really well designed software. So everyone goes like, look at this cool software, and never thinks about the fact that they're just putting all the data into Google now. So Google, of course, has a Chrome web store. Everyone has an app store or web store nowadays. But because their motivation is so different from Apple, the whole process with a web store is really simple. Like, you have a $5 payment once, so they verify that you actually have a credit card. But that's about it. You submit your content, it's directly available. But the fact being that you can only submit stuff that's essentially HTML and JavaScript. The Chrome browser will support Netscape API binary plugins, but for the Chromebook, you can't actually have them. So yeah, it's essentially just HTML, JavaScript, which from a security point of view makes it a lot easier to handle than binary code for place. So let's talk about Apple more in detail. So iPad security architecture, nothing new, I guess. It's a standard XNU kernel, BSD Mach kernel. There's only one user, the user mobile, that runs all the applications. The root user has a fixed password, we all know that. There's additional kernel extension called Seatbelt that essentially hardens the operating system a bit more. Vincenzo was talking about this yesterday. And you have binary code signatures in the actual binaries, so they can make sure that they know the binary they're executing. You have the keychain, so a central storage for user credentials, and ASLR and DEP and whatnot. The integrity protection, and this is similar for both devices, and this is something you will see on pretty much any handheld client platforms, is they now have essentially trusted boot. So what trusted boot does is the first stage verifies the second before starting it, the second verifies the third before starting it, and so on and so on. The iPad and the iPhone do the same thing. So they have the ROM, and then they have the next bootloader, and the next bootloader loads the iBoot, and the iBoot loads the kernel, and the kernel loads everything else. What's kind of bad is if you actually have vulnerabilities in the bootloader in the first stage, because then this whole trust chain is kind of broken. So for recovery purposes, the bootloader will, for example, use something that's called DFU, the device firmware upgrade, I guess, or the device fuck you mode, which you can turn it on and then you can load the second stage of a USB. It's really, really dumb if you have a buffer overflow in that process, because then everyone can load whatever they want over USB, which of course everyone does for the jailbreaks. So that essentially means if you're losing sight of your iPad version 1, even for a very short amount of time, someone can essentially jailbreak your iPad and do whatever they want with it. And then there's X509. That has never in its entire lifetime ever fixed a security problem, but it produced a lot. So the way Apple actually does the verification on boot is they have an Apple root CA, then they have some intermediate CA that is signed by the root CA, then they have yet another, and then there's an end entity, right? So the end entity, for example, is the signature on your second stage booting. So we looked at the bootloader and looked at the code, and it turned out that Apple actually, they didn't even feel to implement the crypto themselves. They actually took a open source crypto library and just baked it into the code. If you do that, there's issues involved with that if you don't understand the code you're baking in. So short explanation for those of you that don't know the details about 509. So the idea with X509 is everyone can sign other stuff, but at some point you don't want to give out a certificate to someone. When you send out a certificate request to VeriSign to say, well, I want this key to be signed for my web server, right, for SSL. VeriSign obviously doesn't want you to be a CA afterwards. So what they give you back is not something you're supposed to use to sign other people's certificates, right? So this is called the basic constraint. So there's a flag in a certificate that's signed that says, well, this certificate can be used to sign other stuff, or it cannot. So Apple actually managed to, not see that point. So Apple, like iOS, actually ships with a self-signed, with a signed certificate, where they also ship the private key. It's on your device. Everyone has a Apple signed certificate and a private key to that. This is used for the push messaging. So the push messaging actually needs to authenticate, so you have a private key and you have a certificate on it. So we looked at it and we found out that the bootloader actually doesn't verify the basic constraints. So we could use that certificate that is on the device to actually sign firmware that's been booted. However, unfortunately for us, the bootloader is coded so crappily that the certificate chain cannot be longer than 3 steps, because they didn't actually code it in a loop, but they actually coded like, check this, check that, check that. So unfortunately, 3 is too short for the certificate that you have on the device. However, we then turned around and said, well, how about userland? Like, okay, did they do the same mistake in userland? And it turns out, yes, of course they did. So essentially, this private key that you have on your device, you can use to sign arbitrary other X509 content, including HTTPS certificates, or email server certificates, or VPN stuff, or whatever. So essentially, SSL was inherently broken on iOS until 4.3.5. So we told Apple, and we're like, oh my God, now they have to backport this to all the devices they ever made, because like there is people that do mission critical shit on iPhone 3G, right? No, like, see this. Windows XP is over 10 years old now. You're still getting security updates. Apple fucks up SSL completely for all apps, for all browsers, for everything on the iPhone and the iPad, and they're just shipping fixes for the latest version. If you don't like your SSL to be broken, go buy a fucking new iPhone. That is so ridiculous. But that's how they do it. So if you still have an older device, you might want to check out the issslrecurity.com website, which will give you a nice little log and tell you that everything is fine, although we have a Apple signed certificate for the domain star that we're running on this web server. So speaking about doing crypto and doing it wrong, Apple also has a signature scheme on the binaries. And this is all well known. Essentially, they sign the binaries with what they call the Mach-O or Macho signature. It's a really, really smart idea to go ahead and build a signature mechanism that actually signs parts of the binary individually, like the code section and the data section and the data read-only section. Because there will never be any metadata that is important for execution. So of course there's a bunch of known exploits that are used mainly in jailbreaks. Essentially what it all boils down to is you always take metadata. The easiest one, the first one was, what they don't sign is the entry point. So the header in a file says this is the entry point, and of course you can change that value and the signature is still correct. So you just slap some stuff on the back of the binary and say here's the entry point, and then it jumps there, executes your code, and everything is good again. This is all known, but it's essentially unfixable. Like the whole process is pretty much unfixable. Now. The update story is also something that's fairly interesting when you talk about the new client platforms. So Apple's update story basically means App Store, and nowadays they can also do over-the-air updates, but we really haven't looked at them yet. App Store has its own story about it. We will come to the App Store later, but keep in mind that this brain-dead review process that nobody knows what they're actually reviewing also applies to security updates. So if I find a vulnerability in your iPhone app or in your iPad app, and I'm even a nice guy and I tell the publisher, and I'm like, here, you fucked it up, like go fix it, like ship a fix. The fix can take up to 4 weeks because someone in the App Store review team was just sitting on it. There is no way to republish an app and say, flag, this is a security fix, like ship it fast. It's the same process as if you updated the, I wanted to say porn, but you're not allowed to upload porn. The content, like you changed an image or whatever. Also, what they also do is mobile phone carrier updates over the air. They're pretty interesting. We haven't looked into the details yet. They're supposed to be signed somehow, but we've seen how well signatures work on Apple in general. And they can set things like, they can set your proxy. Pretty useful thing to do, especially if you want credentials that the user has. So there might be something in for later. Now to the more fun part. The App Store. How does the App Store client actually look like? What is it architectural-wise? Essentially, it's WebKit. Well, fair enough. A lot of JavaScript, a whitelist of domains that can, install stuff on your device, and a little bit signed stuff, signedplists, XML, entitlements. Vincenzo was covering all that. So let's concentrate on the main thing. If you build a custom JavaScript library around WebKit, and you essentially build a browser, right? The security model of the browser heavily depends on the fact that the user has a browser UI. So you can actually see if the site that you're serving at actually says HTTPS and not HTTP. It depends on you seeing that there's a pop-up coming from JavaScript and not from the browser. Well, that's not the case if you're building an App Store application and just bake in standard web security stuff and think this is going to work. But that's exactly what Apple did. So what you can do, like if someone sits, let's say, at Starbucks and doesn't realize that he's just paying $4 for 80% hot water, and he's surfing around with his Apple device, you can just man in the middle his connections. And anytime he hits apple.com or other Apple pages, you can just inject JavaScript. JavaScript like iTunes.buyAction, which, as you would suspect, actually buys shit in the App Store. So there's a cross-site risk CSRF token, which is there to prevent you from doing that shit. However, it's so nicely coded that whatever you inject, the requests that come out afterwards will actually autofill in this token for you. So the programmer of the App Store JavaScript doesn't have to remember that there is a token to be passed. That's pretty hard to fix, actually, because that's the client side and the server side being broken at the same time. So you can do simple things like, this looks pretty normal on an iPad, right? So please give me your Apple ID. The difference being, because that's not a browser, it doesn't tell you that this is actually produced by a little piece of JavaScript that you just injected. So no discernible difference on a real browser. The window would say this is a JavaScript message box. Here, it just looks the same as the legitimate one. Now, even the standard web security wasn't really done right. They have insecure cookies that get leaked over HTTP when you surf, so it's not strictly HTTPS only. You can take over simply sessions because the tokens are not solid. You have cross-site scripting all over the place, and so there's this whitelist, right, that says like those domains can install software on your device, and those domains can actually charge you. This whitelist, of course, includes HTTP-only sites, and you can, from anywhere in the world, from any web page in the world, you can just redirect the browser to ITMS apps :/, and that essentially fires the App Store app. So you can, first of all, you can start this App Store app. Now the only thing you need is control over something that's in the whitelist. How do we call that in security terms? Cross-site scripting. So what did we do? We looked for cross-site scripting on the apple.com domain. We went as far as the first front page because the search field actually had cross-site scripting. So cross-site scripting in a search field, are you kidding me? Yes, that's the way it does. And then, on a sane regular browser, now you would have the issue of injecting all the code that is needed to download, buy, and install an application. A regular browser just ignores stuff that's in a data URL. In a data URI, you can actually encode the content right in the URI. The same browser does not use that as a source for an iframe, for example. Now, the thing is, the App Store app isn't the same browser. So what you can actually do is you create a very long data URL that you put into this cross-site scripting, and you encode all the stuff that is needed to buy, download, install, and run an application. This is how that looks. So essentially, you build a regular link. It could be auto forwarding or whatever. And then you base64 encode everything in here, and that actually buys and installs an application. Now, when we told Apple about this, guess how they fixed it? Anyone want to take a pick how they fixed that? They fixed the cross-site scripting. So if you want to use that same attack today, you need to find a cross-site scripting anywhere on apple.com, you're good. So they only fixed the cross-site scripting in the search field and be done with it. Okay, well, that's a way to go. So what that essentially means is, well, obviously Apple has a lot of power about your devices, and if you're using those devices, fine, but keep in mind that because there's someone controlling the content and the availability of applications, they essentially control your view of reality on that client platform. So unless you have another computer, real computer, that is actually a lot of control of your reality view. For the attacker, it just means, physical access is always going to be a bitch. Like, there's no damn way that Apple in a foreseeable future will secure the devices against physical access. And also, don't be surprised if you have more applications installed after you visited Starbucks than you had before. It's just too fucking easy to do. Now, for the old school people like I am that want to kill everyone who comes even close with the finger to the screen, Google makes the Chromebook. The Chromebook actually has a keyboard. So you're not touching on the same surface that you're trying to read from. So essentially, the architecture of the Chromebook is completely different. You have a Google account that you sign on to, or there's a guest account. The whole Chromebook is designed to be shared, quite in a contrast, and this is why the business background is so important, quite to the contrast to the iPad. The iPad is designed to be one user, one iPad, so they sell more devices. The Chromebook is actually designed to be shared, so you can log on with as many Google accounts as you want. It's a standard Linux operating system. It has a pretty strong prevention of running third-party code, anything that's not shipped. It has a personal firewall. Once we told them, they actually turned on IPv6 firewalling as well. And it also does automatic silent updates. So you can't actually prevent the thing from updating. It will always be online and it will always check for updates and update itself. The only thing you're supposed to run is the Chrome browser. I'm pretty sure everyone is familiar with the Chrome browser. It runs in separate processes, rendering and main process. It has several sandboxing mechanisms. They're pioneered by the guys. It hides the full file system from you. So if you click on something that is not displayable in the browser, the dialog where you can save stuff will only tell you, like, here's your home directory and here's your temp directory, and that's it. Like, you don't see the full file system. It's not a security feature, it's just meant to prevent you from saving it anywhere else where you can't. Funnily enough, they have Flash in the Chrome browser. They compile it themselves. And of course, Flash completely ignores this. And so if you have a Flash app, then you see the whole file system, and you can save stuff anywhere. Anyone remembers the MD5 collision certificate by Alex Sotirov and the guys from 2008, where they made an SSL certificate based on an MD5 collision? So most browser vendors went the way of saying, because it was signed by Equifax, and Equifax actually is a valid CA, as valid as CAs go. So most browser vendors actually went ahead and took this collision certificate that was obviously evil and included it explicitly in the browser so they could blacklist it. Google did the same thing, but forgot the blacklisting part. So they explicitly included the certificate, but it's not blacklisted. So if you manage to convince a Chromebook that today is 2004, you have a valid SSL certificate if you're Alex Sotirov, because you need the private key, obviously. What they also have, in contrast to the Apple products, is a developer mode. So there's a little hardware switch in the device that you can turn on, and then it's developer mode. And you get a big scary screen saying, well, warning, you're about to fuck up the universe. And then you actually have root access and you can play with the device. This is how they do, this again is a trusted boot process. So pretty similar to what Apple does. However, Google is a bit more smart in the devices because they have the whole chain of bootstrap, of firmware loader, of firmware, of kernel, and file system. They have two of those. That is really smart, because that means while they're updating one, they're running the other. So if something goes wrong, they always have a backup to fall back to. So both actually work this way. So you have a read-only memory with a root key. That one verifies the firmware key block. That one verifies the firmware preamble. That one verifies the firmware body. This loads the kernel and verifies the kernel and the kernel preamble, which is additional metadata information. And then the kernel gets loaded and the kernel makes sure that the file system is coherent. That's actually a pretty solid thing. Also, their file system integrity protection is really smart. If any one of you builds embedded devices, this is how you do it. So essentially what they do is, instead of signing individual binaries, they sign the entire fucking partition. And by that, they actually take hashes of the individual blocks of the partition, like for a K, and then the hash of the hashes gets signed. So you end up only having one hash as the integrity protection of the entire file system. Every time you read a block from the block device, which is below the file system, every time you read a block, you verify that the hash is correct. If it doesn't, then you go, which essentially in the Chromebook case means like, please connect me to the internet, I need to reset myself completely. But this is really smart because every time you read a block, if you read it before, it's most likely cached, so you don't have to verify the whole thing again. This is automatically coming from the caching mechanism of your block device driver, so you don't have to do anything about it. And you only verify crypto on demand. So if you're building a small embedded device and you want to make sure that your firmware is intact, this is how you do it. It's actually really good. However, even Google makes mistakes. So the partition table, for example, is not integrity protected. So if someone or something changes your partition table, it's not going to show up. Also, there's a OEM and an EFI partition where the vendor of the Chromebook of the hardware can actually include code for system update or whatever. This is also not integrity protected. So if you're putting an EFI backdoor on the EFI partition, then you own the Chromebook before it even started, and nobody's going to notice. Also, I looked at the details of this whole thing, and I read the code, which nowadays not many people seem to do in security research. So this is what is actually signed when they start the kernel. You see here the partition information is missing. So essentially they have something like a format string where they would put the ID of the root partition and the ID of the kernel partition in when booting. But this is what they sign. Now obviously, and you see the root hash here at the end. Obviously, when they start, they actually have to fill in the blanks and have the actual IDs that they're booting with. So I haven't found a way to exploit this, but I recently read a talk announcement that is going to come out later this year from some French guys that claim to actually have found a way to exploit this. Because essentially, what's not cryptographically protected is where it will take the hashes from. So you can redirect the hashing algorithm to a different partition than the partition you're actually running from. So apparently they found a way to do it. I was too dumb, but that's how it goes. Also, keep in mind what I said initially, that the Chromebook is meant to be shared. Now, for this whole trusted boot to work, this read-only bootloader in the beginning has to be really read-only, right? Well, if you have a couple of minutes with the device and a little bit of soldering iron, then the read-only can be made less read-only very quickly because the chip is well documented, and essentially you have to connect two little pins on the flash chip, and then you can, in the software, essentially say, stop being read-only, and the chip will say, yep, okay, I'm stop being read-only, and you can replace the initial firmware loader, which let's say in a university scenario where everyone is sharing Chromebooks, can be quite successful and fruitful. So the Chromos, in contrast to the Apple devices, actually needs to encrypt the user data. And again, Google is crammed full of very smart people, so they actually developed a pretty decent encryption design for the user content. So even if you have root access to the device, there's very little way for you to actually get to the user content of that user, unless, of course, you get his Google ID password. Then you're in, obviously. So I don't bore you with the details. This is how they do the user home encryption. What's important about this is actually that it's bound on your user password and the machine. So The key is actually dependent on both things, so stealing one doesn't really help you. The update story with the Chromebooks, it checks every 45 minutes. They develop their own protocol. It's called Omaha, of all things. Updates are incremental. So what they do is, because of the block device signatures that I explained, they essentially, the update protocol will actually send you new blocks for the block device. So they diff the old image, hard drive image, so to say, with the new hard drive image and send you the difference. What's really interesting is they also check, well, it's all SSL and everything, nice, but they also check the integrity when they download the update. What's interesting about it is they check it after they applied it. So the short of it is they download individual blocks that they write to your hard drive, and then once they're done, they check whether the checksum was good. So if anything goes wrong in between, well, that's an interesting way to do it. But it's also wrapped in SSL, so it's hard to get in there. But there's a couple of theoretical attacks that you can do if you have an SSL certificate, or if they pulled an Apple or something. And then you have the web store. So the web store essentially is downloadable web apps. It's all JavaScript and the same procedure as with all other devices. You essentially click on an app. It says, I want to have access to all your user data and your porn and your address book, and you say, yeah, whatever, and then you get it. Extensions can be free or they can be paid for. And the extension scripting in Chrome, if you've never done this, is actually, it's almost like it's invented for banking Trojans, because a Chrome extension can be what's called a content script. The content script gets triggered for particular domains and is there to rewrite the content you see in a browser. So everything that the banking Trojans on Windows do with really hard work and injecting code into Internet Explorer and stuff, no, it's built in Chrome. It's a lot more stable and better. So if you actually have a malicious extension, that can actually rewrite web pages for you in a very convenient way. So it's almost like they're designed for that. What's interesting is the paid extensions, for example. How you get the paid extensions is you have to go through Google Checkout and then pay for the extension, and then you get a link with the extension ID. So we noticed that the link is always the same thing except for the extension ID. So we looked up expensive extensions, put in the extension ID, and you know what? They get installed. We didn't have to buy them. Also, you can, if you have like in your Google account, you can also say I'm a Chrome user, and every time I start Chrome and I log into my Google account, I want you, Google, to install me all the extensions I have on all the other Chrome instances that I run on a different computer. That's very nice. You can also just include extension IDs of an extension that you wanted to run, because when you start Chrome, it will automatically install them all for you, no matter if you paid or not. What I liked the most was when we talked to Google about this, and they looked at each other and said, well, we should probably update the documentation to reflect this. It's again a question of your business model. They don't care whether some extension developer that tries to make a living off his extension actually gets ripped off or not, because that's not in their interest. They're not taking a 30% cut as Apple does. So they update the documentation instead of updating the code. As easy as that. So also, like, how can you install malicious extensions? Well, one thing obviously is, you break into the Google account and you just say Google Sync, here's another extension, and then next time this person logs in, this extension gets installed. But for that, you would need his Google password, and that's more theoretical than practical. What was really practical was the API that they use, the web API, they also exposed over HTTP. So as in the Apple scenario, we could actually inject JavaScript into regular pages and say, here, go download this extension and install it, which Google fixed. They're pretty quick in fixing shit. Also, the confirmation dialog, like, do you really want to install this extension, was rendered in JavaScript, and there was the possibility to use more JavaScript to automatically click OK. So you wouldn't actually see it. And as I mentioned, like a malicious extension, once you have a malicious extension in your Chrome browser, you're pretty much fucked. That is also true for the Chrome browser on other operating systems. So if you're using Chrome browser, make sure that you're checking your extensions from time to time, because it is really, really easy to make them self-installing, simply because the extension management dialog is also rendered in JavaScript. So you can automatically install extensions, so you should check that. But then, like, you have this really, really secure, comparably, really secure client platform. Now the question is, okay, now I put all my data into the cloud. In the Google term, it's Google Apps. Is it any safer now? So the rules for the Google App games that you have to keep in mind is, if your account is compromised, if someone learns your Google ID password, you're fucked. That's it, game over, right? There's very little you can actually do, and there's very little you can do to even notice. The same holds true, and this is for all cloud applications, for your session cookies. If your session cookie goes away at some point in its lifetime, it's as if you lost your password. You have to understand that. There needs to be one single HTTP request in this whole HTTPS site that you have not controlled, and whoops, there goes your session cookie, and it goes over wireless LAN in Starbucks, and someone else is making funny faces. Also, you should actually read the terms when you're using stuff. So if Google doesn't like you for any reason anymore, and they simply close your account, stuff is gone. It's unrecoverably gone. If you can live with that, fine. However, if someone else can make Google not love you anymore, US government, for example, then the same holds true. As long as you keep all those things in mind, feel free to use the cloud. But this is what is often overlooked. And well, as I said, the protections must not only cover your account, but also all the session information to your account that comes with third-party cloud applications working on your account. We're going to see in a minute how that looks like. Fun fact in between, we looked at Google Docs, and Google Docs allows you to write macros in something that's close to JavaScript. And you essentially run them on Google Docs, so they run on Google's server. There's again like an app store for it, so you can use someone else's macros. The fun part is one of the most common macros to be used is a Russian macro for checking credit card number validity. It's actually not malicious. We looked really hard, it's actually not malicious. However, the idea of blindly importing JavaScript code from a Russian guy that I have no control over into my Google Docs spreadsheet to check credit card numbers struck me as brave, so to say. But that's the thing. Like you can, like when you import someone else's macro, you look at the macro once, you say, okay, I want to use that. If he changes the macro, you don't get any notification. So if that Russian guy actually turns cybercrime at some point, he's going to have a really good life. Also, what we found interesting is that the macros can actually issue HTTP requests. Only Google can DOS Google. You reach something about like, what was it, like 500 gigs per second transfer rate if Google talks to Google. That's pretty fast. Also, it's, we stopped playing at that point, but let's just say source IP address based firewalling really doesn't work so well if the attacker actually runs code in your cloud. And then, of course, there's web security issues. This is an issue that we found where you could switch the account. Like when you switch from one Google account to the other, which you're not supposed to do because you're supposed to have everything in one account, right? You can actually essentially, they had, again, a session that was not only over HTTPS, but also over HTTP. So you can essentially log into a Google account. Then when the victim wants to log in, you intercept the victim. You use your session to Google and claim to the victim that he just logged in. And when he really logs in, he effectively switches accounts. So you will see a short, as the victim, you will see a short website that doesn't look like the regular sign-in, but like the account switching website. But that's really hard to notice. And then essentially you can steal one of the many, like there's many tokens that come with a Google session, but one of them is unencrypted. You can essentially steal it, and then back in the scenario where you have the session cookie, you own the account. They fixed that by now, but it shows the general pattern. If in this whole conglomerate of web applications, there's one single HTTP request that doesn't look where to send the cookie to, you have a hole in your cloud. And well, you would think Google, full of smart people, they will not have standard web security issues. Of course they do. So for example, on Google sites, they try to prevent JavaScript. So you can't put JavaScript into a Google site. But of course, you can put it into an embed tag that executes JavaScript. You can put it into SVG file that executes JavaScript. You can put the SVG on Google Docs. So now you're running JavaScript on the Google domain. What can possibly go wrong? And other services like Postini, the email security service, that executes JavaScript in email headers and in email subjects. So if you're managing the email accounts of the people that you're trying to protect, then you execute JavaScript in your browser. Fine enough. Also, here's the issue with third-party cloud providers. So let's say Eve.com has this really cool addition to your Google account that needs only a little bit of access to your data. So Google wants to make sure that you actually gave Eve.com permission to access your data in your Google account. Now, the way they do that is unfortunately using GET parameters. GET parameters are, and that's no news, very, very nice because they're included in the refer field. So you can essentially construct something like this, where you get asked, here's this, Google asks you whether this company, this site called google.com wants to access your calendar and your Picasa pictures. Sounds pretty legit, doesn't it? And you see in the URL, we're not faking it, it's all Google. It's all google.com. The thing is, it's a search request and the I feel lucky button. So essentially, what it does at the end is it accesses our website, and in the refer, there's this whole thing, including the access token that allows our cloud service now to steal all your data from your Google account. So what that means for you, what can Google do? Well, anything they want. You're putting all your eggs into their bag. If the whole G+ account story of people being like kicked out because their name doesn't sound like their real name doesn't taught you a lesson, then nothing will. I'm sorry, that's just the fact. There's several ways to get your Google account owned, and that's not just the password. So while the client platform, the Chromebook, is a role model in device security. They really did a pretty decent job on it. That doesn't protect your Google account automatically. So if only one thing, like one token, one password gets lost, it can mean entire company pwnage, as some people, HB Gary, experienced quickly. What I heard, interestingly enough, is when HB Gary was owned, they knew that their emails are downloaded, and they tried for 8 hours to reach someone at Google to close their account. They could see their emails going out, and nobody did. So how's that for a service level agreement? So physical access to the Chromebook is the same as with other client platforms. If you have physical access, gone, so the security of the device plays big role. And Chrome extensions are evil. So what I'm trying to say is, whatever fanboy you are, whether you're Apple fanboy or Google fanboy or whatever, that's not the reason they built those things. That's not the reason they offer you the service. The reason they offer you the service is money. It's not a bad thing per se, but you have to keep in mind what the business model behind this is to understand how much they care about your security and why. If you rely on a cloud platform, you're putting your eggs in someone else's basket. Even if that basket has bright primary colors, it doesn't mean it's a better basket than your own. So it's a thing for consideration whether you want to trust another company that you probably don't even have legal connections to with your critical data or not. What I find interesting that like web security bugs are, they're even existing with companies where we're pretty sure they know what they do. It's, especially in a cloud scenario, it's extremely hard to get everything right and have not this one little web page that leaks your tokens or that leaks your cookies. So even Google has issues doing that. This is also important to keep in mind when you look at other clouds. If Apple really wanted to protect your data, you would have full drive encryption by now. That's a fact. And they will allow you to use your own keys from your own PKI and not their keys. So everything else is just, simulation of encryption. And even the big internet companies still think that the OWASP top 10 is something they need to comply with. So they need to have them all instead of like not having them. That is quite fascinating. And with that, if there's any questions? No? Bored you to that? Sorry about that. Well, thanks for coming.